Good afternoon, everybody. You can all hear me okay? Even in the back? Fantastic. Thank you so much. My name is Dr. James Herrera Brooks, and I serve as the Melanie Trent DeShutter Senior Director for Research and Publications here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this noontime lecture in our Scholar Series. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the very generous support of Comrade Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC Scholar Series. Comrade has served as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution and has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former President, VMHC President and CEO, Dr. Charles F. Bryan, whom this series also honors. Before we begin with today's program, I just want to start by making you aware of a couple of upcoming events here at the VMHC. The first, which I hope you'll all be familiar with already, we've been banging the drum about it for quite a while now, is going to be the opening of our 250th signature exhibition, Give Me Liberty, Virginia and the Forging of a Nation. To our knowledge, this will be the first major exhibition of the 250th commemorations of America's founding to go on display in the nation. Produced in partnership with the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, the exhibition provides fresh perspectives on the Revolution, exploring the actions of Virginians, both iconic and ordinary, who together established a new nation and changed the world. So we're very excited for that, and we hope to see many of you here on Saturday, 22nd of March, when that show opens. And there'll also be some member previews, which if you are a member, you should have had updates about. Join us again also on the evening of March 26th at 6 p.m. for a very special evening lecture by the award-winning historian and biographer Heath Lee on her latest book, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life of Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady. And this is actually a rescheduling from an earlier event that we had in the calendar. So just to confirm, that's going to be March 26th at 6 p.m. Now, as we go into today's program, I just want to remind you all to take a moment to just check your mobile phones or any other devices that can make a noise or vibrate, buzz, anything like that. And I just encourage you to, or I demand of you to switch them to silent, do not disturb, or onto the off mode. So moving on to today's program. Today's program taps into a story of strength, courage, and beauty found in difficult times and the most challenging of circumstances. In the century between 1865 and 1965, from Reconstruction to desegregation, Black residents in Hanover County embraced liberty as they organized for education, employment, and religious freedom. Together, they built a community that flourished in the face of white retrenchment and day-to-day oppression. Here today to explore this crucial community-level history and provide an overlooked yet vital perspective of the civil rights movement in the rural South are Drs. Jody Allen and Phyllis Slade Martin. Dr. Jody Allen, who is to my immediate left, is the Assistant Professor of History and the Robert Francis Engs Director of the Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation at the College of William and Mary. Her research interests cover the US Civil War through the long civil rights movement, and she is the author and co-author of several scholarly essays, and of course, the author of Roses in December, Black Life in Hanover County, From the Civil War to Civil Rights, the book that forms the basis of today's conversation. And joining Jody and in conversation with her is Dr. Phyllis Slade Martin, who holds a PhD in history from George Mason University. She owns Slade's & Associates, a research, education, and organizational consulting business. And previously, she served as the director of the African American Studies Research and Resource Center and as the associate director of the African American program at George Mason University. Her research interests include race, gender, the church, and resistance in the United States and around the world. So please join me in welcoming Doctors Jody Allen and Phyllis Slade Martin for a wonderful conversation.
So I'd like to welcome you all here and thank you for hosting us and this important discussion today. I am going to ask Jody, I think you, Associate Professor Jody Allen, if you would like to begin with reading a passage. But first, I do want to congratulate Jody on Roses in December. Roses in December is a beautifully written and well-researched book. And, I was so taken by the book. You can see all of my holes. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of these things. Jody reminds me that this is a 1-hour program. But just to let you know, there's so many beautiful stories in the book, and it's woven in such a vivid manner that we learn much about the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, into the civil rights period. And I have to say that I never imagined being so intrigued by Hanover County, Virginia. So, Jody.
So I want to read a story that I began the preface with that kind of leads us into what led me into the writing of the book after I experienced this. It was November 8th, 2005, Election Day. The weather was beautiful, and there was a steady turnout of people voting in Virginia's most hotly contested gubernatorial campaign since 1989, when L. Douglas Wilder became the first elected African-American governor in the United States. It was late morning in Ashland, the only incorporated town in Hanover County, Virginia, and I observed a Black man in his late 70s or early 80s leaning on his cane as he exited the public library where he had just cast his ballot. As he approached a campaign volunteer distributing information for the Democratic Party candidates, he proudly pointed to the sticker on his jacket that read, "I voted." The white campaign worker, who appeared to be his contemporary, beamed back at him and said, "You're a good boy." The man's steps hesitated, and his already slow forward movement slowed even more. While he never stopped smiling, he remarked, almost to himself, that he was just remembering the old days when people used to call men boys. The campaign volunteer, noticeably embarrassed, hastily explained that she had not meant to be offensive. The man replied, "I know, I was just remembering," and he continued on his way. The volunteer's immediate response and red face indicated that she too remembered, at least when events jogged her recollection. The woman's turn of phrase carried the man back to a time when his manhood was questioned by virtually an entire nation, especially white Southerners. He remembered when legalized segregation and overt racism severely restricted the lives of African Americans. He probably never heard Black adults referred to or addressed as Mr. or Mrs. outside of his community. It was a time when most African Americans were not allowed to vote in elections, when public schools for Black children, while prized by the communities they served, were substandard and lacked basic equipment. On the other hand, like his contemporaries interviewed for this book, the old man might have also remembered Black and white farmers sharing tools and other equipment, and Black and white children playing together, at least before the first grade. He was remembering the early 20th century when a white employer could weep at the funeral of a Black woman who had worked for them or raised them, but would decline an invitation to join her family at her home after leaving the cemetery. It was a complex time. It is chiefly this period of this man's earlier memories the Jim Crow era, or what I refer to here as the era of disfranchisement that this book explores.
Thank you. Thank you. That is very powerful. You know, this idea of notion of place. I heard growing up, it's not your place to do this. This is your place. That's not your place. As a child, this is what you are responsible for, or these are the limits or the restrictions that might impact you and impact our interactions. And so when you think of Black Hanoverians and their engagement, as you were describing, and interaction with white Hanoverians, what were some of the notions of place in Hanover regarding role expectations of Blacks and whites in Hanover County? And how did Black Hanoverians respond to efforts to restrict their place or restrict their movement?
Well, there was very distinctly a place that Black Americans belonged in, and that was throughout the South and throughout the country, really. I mean, you had a particular place that was acceptable, and once you stepped out of that place, you could be in trouble. And one of the stories I talk about in the book is he was a boy at the time when I interviewed him. He was in his 80s. But Robert Grimes worked at a local, I guess it was a drugstore, soda shop kind of place. And he worked, there was a young white girl there. They were about the same grade in schools, but of course in different schools. And they both worked after school, and they would get there early. And so they would kind of study together, and she was not yet 17, but shortly before she was to turn 17, the wife, there was a couple that owned the store. The wife took him aside and said, after this, I don't remember her name, she's going to be turning 17 soon, and you will need to refer to her as Miss and her last name. And he said, basically, no, I will refer to her as Miss when she refers to me as Mr. Grimes. And so the wife said, well, I'm going to have to, tell my husband, because that will not be appropriate for you to call her by her first name any longer. And so he left the store intending never to go back. But apparently her husband wasn't as upset about it as she was, or he was a very good worker and he didn't want to lose him. I don't know what happened, but Robert Grimes went back to work, and he never called this young woman Miss in her last name. And so, but he was challenging his place. His place in that community was subservient, was less than. He could be called by his first name, but he had to refer to white people by Mr., Mrs., or Miss. And there are lots of these kinds of situations, I guess, that happen where people resisted their assigned place. Those who voted even after 1902, who managed to either actually vote or who tried to vote, were also challenging their place. And so that is really a lot of what what I try to write about and try to explain, that you can resist your situation in many different ways. And some is simply as saying, I'm not going to call you X, Y, or Z. There was another story that just comes to me about this. I interviewed a woman who remembered that her father and her grandfather only ever gave their first initial to white people in particular. And even when they would say, well, what's your name? And her father would just say J. And she just thought they didn't like their first names, but she found out later as an adult that her father did that intentionally, because if he didn't know his name, he could not call him by his first name. So again, people tried to put him in that place, but he resisted it in a way that was meaningful and frustrating for the others at the same time.
You know, you use so many different types of resources and analysis of those sources. Can you talk a bit about the sources? And that's one of the reasons, as I went through and kind of highlighted so many things, is that you brilliantly use the sources to weave this story that gives us a vivid picture. So there are stories that, as you just described, and then there are stories in which you talk about data, and you combed through all of this data and made analysis of the data. Can you talk about the approach that you took, the method that you took to bring all of this together in the story?
Okay, you put me on a spot when you call it brilliant, but
it is.
But, well, there had not been a book written on Black Hanover when I started my research, but I started basically looking at local newspapers, looking for clues of where to go next, and so I found information. There were stories about Black people in the community in the newspapers, and so that those kind of tidbits or tips would send me other places. Also, Freedmen's Bureau records were pretty amazing for Hanover County. They had some agents were better at writing reports than others, and there were the ones in Hanover were pretty good, and they were also pretty fair to the Black community there. Something called the Southern Claims Commission reports, when after certain these Southern claims, Southerners could make claims if they lost property during the Civil War. And if they could prove they had been loyal to the Union, even though they were in the South, and to prove that this property had been lost to you, the agents would come from DC to the community and interview people, making sure that you had owned your land had been fenced off, or you did have a house, or you did have X number of cows, or what have you. And so those affidavits that were taken is a very rich source of information. Of course, letters, county records, with the county board of supervisor meetings, wills, census records, and that type of thing. One of the stories that I learned, in particular, looking at the Southern Claims Commission, which was really fascinating to me, it was a Black man named Peter Storrs who had applied for reimbursement for loss of property. And his story, though, was that before the war, he had been enslaved in Hanover, and he was a shoemaker. And sometimes skilled craftspeople had a little bit more leeway than, say, someone who was working in the fields. And so he had worked out with his enslaver that he would make a certain amount of shoes for the enslaver a year, and then over that he could keep $50. And so he was able to save $50 a year. It's not clear how long it took him, and he was married as much as Black people or an enslaved person could be married at the time. He was in a committed relationship with children. His wife was a free Black woman. He saved the money, and he gave the money to her to buy land. And then he continued to work until he could buy his own freedom, which he bought around 1854, 1855, somewhere in there. And so once they became free, they built a 4-room house. They had animals. They farmed. They had it seemed like a productive enterprise. Well, they woke up, he says, one Sunday morning and found themselves in between the lines, the Confederate Army on one side and the Union Army on the other. And a Union soldier came to the door and said, and basically explained, this is what's happening. We can't let you go to Union lines because the Confederates are probably going to try to shoot you. And we're not going to let you go to Confederate lines. So you have to stay in the house. And so they hid in the potato cellar until after the battle, which it says lasted about half an hour or so. When they came out, basically everything around them had been destroyed. Their house, everything was gone. So they spent the rest of the war in Washington, D.C. And so he comes back after the war. But anyway, I started off talking about place, but I love this story, so I had to tell you all of it. But he challenged again, he was a person who was an enslaved person, but he also challenged this place. Now, he had some leeway to do that. He had an agreement that he could make and save money. But again, he was challenging this place of what an enslaved man could do. He challenged those limitations. So,
yeah. When I think of the stories you share and the life experience of Blacks in Hanover County, how did they manage? How did they have the strength to endure? What were some of the strategies? I know you talk a lot about education, spirituality, and finance. How did they manage to keep going as they were faced with major life challenges and the realities of white supremacy in the county?
Well, from the beginning, I mean, from the time that they became free, sometimes you hear these stories about how enslaved people weren't ready for freedom. They didn't know how to act in freedom. But remember, they had a couple centuries to watch people around them. They understood what being free was because they understood what being enslaved meant. And so there was no question. I haven't found any indication of anyone who said, well, I just didn't know what to do. Of course, there were some people, I mean, they had to get used to this idea that they didn't have to ask permission to do whatever it was they wanted to do. They were free to educate their children, to educate themselves. But it wasn't like they desired to be re-enslaved because they just didn't know how to handle it. There's in Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington mentions how everybody celebrated for a while, and then they got kind of quiet in thinking about, okay, what does this mean? But again, nobody was wanting to be a slave again, and that was certainly true for folks in Hanover. And I mean, the war ended in 1865, and you have, a church opening in 1866, Shiloh Baptist Church. You have, that church was also a school. They figured out how to hire, they hired a man from Richmond to come teach. He was supposed to get 50 cents from each family of the kids. And if they couldn't afford that, sometimes the families would put them up, as a place, place to stay or feed them. And so they worked out, they understood about organizing, figured out how to do what they needed to do. They knew how to farm. The county was largely agrarian. So that wasn't a problem. Some of them became tenants or sharecroppers on the land that they had once been enslaved on, but they were earning money at this point. Some, found jobs doing other things. I even found that in the census that there was a potter. I'm very curious about him because he's the only one in the census that I've come across, and I'm very curious to find out, what kind of work he did and that type of thing. And so, again, they were like schools, and if adults couldn't actually go to school themselves, they wanted their children to go. Many and sometimes the children would come home and teach them. They wanted to learn how to read the Bible for themselves, right? Most of them, I think, understood that they needed to maybe question what they had been taught before about what Christianity was, and certain things had been, kept from them. And so they wanted to, again, read the Bible for themselves. They wanted to make money. They wanted to keep their families together, which had not been something that was guaranteed during the institution of slavery. So they found places to live. Sometimes the Freedmen's Bureau was there to also help them negotiate fair contracts, because most of them could not read or write. And so they needed someone to support their again, contracts and what have you. I don't know if I.
Yeah, I think I think you did, and that just that also that emphasis on education and the ways in which the community work together. There are some interesting perspectives that you share too about, in some cases, there were ways in which there were interesting commonalities, or there are assumptions that we might make that may have been a bit different in Hanover County, this rural county. You talk about things like there were some schools in which there was a fairly equal, or appeared to be fairly equal in some of the schools over different times, or the stories you talk about with the Black wives, women who were married women who their full-time job was to stay at home and to do that. Can you share any why that may have been the case, with some exceptions that we see that might not be what we often think about?
Well, I guess when you starting with talking about wives, there was a lack of safety for a lot of Black women during slavery. They could be attacked by a son, an overseer, or the owner of the plantation, or what have you. And so you do have Black men and women making decisions that their wives are not going to work outside of the home. And sometimes that was seen, they were seen as putting on airs, my wife isn't going to work, or I'm not going to work outside of the home. But it was a safety question for some of them, feeling more not wanting the same kinds of things to be carried on after, during freedom. Some women didn't have a choice. Some were single, and some, just for whatever reason, they had to work outside the home. But generally, what they tried to do was remain away from the enslaver. I don't know. I should write down the questions.
But that's good.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you certainly answered that. And I want to switch a little bit and talk about the taking away the right to vote. First, having the right to vote, at least Black men in Hanover County, for a while after the Civil War, Reconstruction, and then the total disfranchisement. Or move toward the goal of disfranchisement. And so can you describe, tell us about Black life leading up to and after disfranchisement in the county?
Well, I mean, part of being a citizen was the right to vote. And Black men had received the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. And so they expected to be able, to do that. No women had the right to vote, but I do believe that Black women and men talked about about voting and consulted with each other. I don't have any direct evidence of that, but I believe that happened at least in some instances. And you have the first time they had an opportunity to vote was the 1868 Constitutional Convention that the delegates had to come together and do a new state constitution that would ratify within Virginia the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so they had an election for delegates, and they had there were two white men, I think it was Nathaniel Crenshaw, and I forget the second man's first name, but his last name was, I think it was William James. And there was Hanover had a delegate and one floater, and that meant there was a person who would serve Hanover and parts of Henrico. And so everybody seemed to think that both of these men had been loyal Union men, and everybody seemed to think that they were shoo-ins. And there was a mention of a man named Burwell Toller running. He had been enslaved. He was a carpenter. He was also a traveling preacher. And he said, his response was, I'm not prepared. I'm not educated enough to do this. Well, it's not clear in the record why he changed his mind, but he ends up running against Crenshaw, who for the floater position, and he won. And so you have Burwell Toller representing parts of Henrico and Hanover, and then William James, who was representing the rest of Hanover. And but there were also two other white men who ran, and they were really simply perplexed that only 3 Black people or Black men voted for them. And let me see if I can find it. I think, this is the response of the Freedmen's Bureau agent. He says, they could not understand why Black men should have refused to support those who, when they had the power, ground them down under the worst form of oppression. But he got it, but they didn't get it. They didn't understand why only 3 Black men had voted for them. And so anyway, so the convention happens. All I could find about Toller was that he did present some data or what have you, to be considered. It's not clear if there were people who, wrote up, like today, people write the laws and what have you, whatever needs to be written. It's not necessarily our congressmen and women who are doing the writing. There's somebody hired. So I don't know if somebody did that for him. He put forth a bill related to the Eastern State, what they called at the time, the Eastern State Lunatic Asylum. But he did some other things, and he voted every time. I could see that he voted every time a vote came up and what have you. I know that he became a landowner after all of that, but it's not clear. And I know that there's some, people you will see in movies like Gone with the Wind or Birth of a Nation, how Black men in elected positions were basically drinking and carrying on and just, useless. And that wasn't the case. That's fiction for real. But the extent to it's hard to tell. But so that they took this seriously. They took the voting seriously. They understood, again, when they were enslaved and they saw the enslavers talking about voting, because they were talked around like, they didn't have ears. And so, but they learned how to survive. They learned what to do, how life worked, I guess I should say. So, and they were ready to step in as much as they could be.
Well, one of the things you talk about is the way the attempts to restrict and remove the right to vote. And so there was a lot of activity in the Virginia Assembly, for example, to take away the vote. And you describe things like voter fraud, tampering with elections, and they were very common and became a characteristic of Virginia. So my question is, does that sound familiar?
I guess it does. Yeah, there was a lot. Now, Virginia has always been kind of known as this genteel state. They kind of prided themselves on not being Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia, right? There was they were doing the same kind of things. They were just being a little more proper about it. And so they kept figuring out these ways to control the vote. At one point it was they would mark and ballots were not consistent then, so they would use something called tissue ballots, and different printers might print them so you could. What would happen is they would use tissue paper. They would cut them the size of a ballot. They would be marked, you could mark them. And so somebody would go into the polls with a stack of tissue ballots in their pocket. They would get their ballot to vote and they would mark that, but then they would put all the tissue ballots in the box at the same time. It was not like it is at all like it is today. And so, and what would happen at night when the polls closed, there was supposed to be the same number of ballots in the box as there were people who had signed the roll. And so what they would do, somebody would, be blindfolded. They would stick their hand in the box and they were to pull out X number of ballots so that the number of ballots in their hand equal the number on the book. Well, they knew how the tissue ballots were marked and they felt differently. So they would pull out the others and leave the tissue ballots in. So when it was time to count, whoever they wanted to win won. And so that was one way. Another way was they decided you had to mark, I think it was a quarter of the way through the name that you did not want. I mean, how do you anyway? And so but it was there was somebody who was judging whether or not it was far enough across the name of the person. So that was another way. And so then you start having people saying, okay, yes, we're getting what we want, but we need to do this appropriately, right? We need to. And so they voted twice about having a constitutional convention. And both times they lost because they didn't. The majority did not want to do that. But the third time they voted and they had a constitutional convention, which started in 1901 and went until 1902. They looked at the entire Constitution, including the franchise, and that's when they established a poll tax and an understanding clause. And so most people, if you say now poll tax was $1.50, that doesn't sound like much, but $1.50 might have fed your family for a week. So that wasn't an easy thing to do. Also, the understanding clause was, and there's a story in the book about an Ashland poll worker who he leaves, and when he writes his memoir, he talks about how they would, like if a Black person came in and you read them something, they would say, "You don't understand that, do you?" And if a white person came in and said and read this and heard the same thing read, they would say, "You understand that, don't you?" You know, and so that was their way of taking that was a more proper way of taking the vote. And eventually people, you still had in Ashland you still had about 60 Black men who were able to register to vote. And it's not clear exactly why they were allowed to and actually voted. There's one story that a woman I interviewed, she believes that her great-grandfather, the story was that his father was a white doctor in the county. He looked like a white man. But she believed his granddaughter I interviewed her when she was about 90. And she believed that he had been allowed to vote because of his connection with this doctor, that he was the descendant of this doctor. But it's not really clear why these 60 men were able to. But the other side of that, though, is 60 votes isn't going to make a difference. So there's a possibility that they did that so they could, if the federal government decided to do some checking, they could say, well, no, it's only 60 Black men who are eligible to vote. We let them vote, So I don't know why. I'm not sure. But that was true across the state when I'm looking at the numbers, that there were still, a few men who had the opportunity to vote throughout.
And see, that response says to me, this is why they needed religion. So my next question, this is why religion was so important. My next question is about spirituality and religion. They are recurring themes in your book as well. Can you talk about the role of Black churches in working with the Black community in Hanover County as they pursued citizenship rights?
Well, the church was one of the few places that they could own, right? It was generally, especially if, when we're talking later or after Reconstruction, they were getting land and they were able to build. So the churches were not only places of worship, but they were places for community meetings. They were often also the schoolhouse. And so that was one, but also, they had a strong belief in where God had brought them and where he was going to take them. And that was where that belief buoyed them many times. But the churches were places of, they socialized in the churches. There was one story that related to the true reformers, and that's a very complicated story. We could be here all day, but they had a meeting at this church, Shiloh Baptist Church in Ashland, because there were two sides were kind of this internal conflict, and they meet at the church, and these two people who are supposedly being sanctioned when the group voted, they decided no, they were not guilty. Well, this one woman got so angry that she threw a lamp, and back then there was flame in that lamp. And so so the church could be many different things, but it was a place that they could control, that they didn't have to worry so much about. So and they, that comfort that they got in church was also, I think, what helped them to keep moving forward.
Before we open up for questions and start thinking of your questions, I don't know if there's a place that people can come or just stand up and ask questions, but I want to ask this one last question. When you look at Hanover County today, what challenges persist? What opportunities and changes do we see?
I think there are definitely many positive changes in the county, certainly since this time. There's a county building now named after Martha Ann Fields, who she and her family escaped slavery behind the Union Army in 1863 or 64. There's a reenactment of at Hanover Tavern that's going on all this month, actually, for fourth graders, and they're interpreting. There's an interpreter who's covering George Washington Fields, who goes on to become an attorney, and he and his brother practice in Newport News. And so there's on their website, there's a story about a Black Hanoverian family and the sons who fought in every conflict, at least in the 20th century. But there's also over 90 books have been banned in Hanover County this year. And so that's still an issue. I don't know how far to go because I live there. But it's very much, it's always been, I think, a red county, and that hasn't changed. And so, but I do think there's certainly been positive movement.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to give opportunities. We can give some applause now. I'm telling you, it's a really good. We can take some questions from the audience if you have questions. We have a question back there, and there's one right here.
On the issue of are things better today, it seems to me that the naming of schools should have been on your list. Back when we were facing those issues of spending public tax dollars to memorialize the Confederate heroes, I remember the Hanover School Board decided they would take a vote of the parents at Stonewall Jackson and Lee Davis, and lo and behold, the vote came out equal to the enrollment, 80% white, 20% black, said we ought to keep the names. And now I believe the names have changed to other names, and I think that is a sign of progress.
Yeah, it is, and it's in my epilogue. I just forgot it. But no, it's Mechanicsville High, and that was Lee Davis, and I forget Stonewall Jackson. Bell Creek, maybe Bell Creek. I know, but they both have changed. Although there's some rumbling about changing them back, but we won't go there. We don't have to talk about that.
Hi. I have two questions. One kind of looking backwards and thinking about the Equal Justice Initiative and the work they've done to document lynchings. And so I was hoping perhaps you could say a few words about the history of lynchings in Hanover County or that area of Virginia. So that's one question looking backwards. And then one kind of more contemporary, if you were to entitle this era that we're living in now, so I haven't read your book, The Era of Disenfranchisement, but it'll be the next book I purchased upstairs. But if you were to entitle what we're living in right now, what might you title this era and why?
Okay, tell me your first, that just pushed the first question out. What was your first question, please?
My first question was about the documentation of
right. Yeah.
In or around Hanover County.
Yeah. Honestly, I have not come across any lynchings in my research. There was a story, there's a 1902 story that they refer to as the Ashland Riot that started with Black man who was apparently known in the town, and for they believed he was shot in error, well, definitely in error, by a part-time police officer. There was one police officer, but sometimes they would need two, and they would bring in this part-time person. And he shot and killed this Black man. And there were two stories that kind of came out of that. One, well, he was put in, no, oh, well, I'm getting it twisted up. There was a Black man who was put in jail, not clearly let me back up. He was put in jail for allegedly beating a white man. And there was some concern that he might be taken out of the jail and lynched. And so they decided to move him to Richmond, which they did quietly. And he was fine. And I've never been able to find out any information about him and what happened to him after that. So, but around this same time, one night, this is where the two stories come in. There was a Black man who was known in the town. He was walking back from work, and he came upon this incident that was happening at near the train station. On one side, there was a group of white men standing and then on the other side was a Black saloon. And as the story goes, a rock was thrown from the Black side, hit someone, a white man. But just as they were about to retaliate, the train came. And by the time the train left, the Black people had gone away. So then you have this Black man walking home from work, no clue about what was going on. And he gets shot. And so one of the stories of the Ashland riot is it came out as a result of that. But there's another story that is kind of the typical story that you heard at that time, was that a white girl had been attacked by a Black man. And so you have both of these stories kind of, going on, and people from different times. I found a story in an autobiography, but there was never really anything that we would call a riot. But it was centered on these kind of tropes that Black men attacked a white girl, or Black man did X, Y, or Z. They brought the mayor, because they were going to do a coroner's inquest, and the mayor brought in the militia. They asked the governor to send the militia to Ashland, and they came. He asked them to, walk around town and see what was going on. Well, they did that, and they came back and said, we don't see anything. There was one group of Black people, but who weren't talking about rioting or hurting anyone. They were just kind of grouped together or something. And he said, as soon as they told him, they dismissed. And so but then he asked them to stay until after the coroner's report, because they thought if the community didn't like what they heard, then there might be a riot. And they did hear what you might think they would have heard, which was, nobody was at fault, basically. And so they released the body, his family buried him, and there was never a riot. But that's what the headline says, because when I was looking through the newspapers and I saw Ashland riot, I thought, but this was shortly after the Constitution of 1902, which disfranchised most Black people, had been passed. But that is not. Now, my next project, I'm going to be looking at antebellum. Well, one of them anyway. I'm going to be looking at antebellum Hanover. And so there might be some differences there. But in terms of what I found, I didn't find any lynchings. And what would I call this time period?
I was wondering if she was gonna circle back to that question. Okay.
Oh, wow. Well, just in general, scary. And unfortunately, I think it's going to challenge the franchise. Maybe not like they did before, but I do think that it could come to that. I want to be more positive. I don't think it will necessarily, but I think it could come to some of the days. Because I remember thinking and wondering why my grandparents and my great grandparents and my great aunts, some of the things I read, about, the what I call, as you say, the era of disfranchisement. I did wonder, like, why did they even come out of the house? It seemed like it would be so frightening. And then one day I was leaving Williamsburg and I was listening to NPR and they were saying something that made me think about those questions I used to have. And I thought, why did I come out of the house? And I think part of it is you have to keep living, right? You can't just go into hiding. But I do think that there could be, I am hoping I'm very, very wrong. But I think that there could be some days like the old days that we might experience. And that's just me. I'm not magic.
My husband and I moved to Ashland in 1997, and at that time, the Hanover County Black Heritage Society was getting organized. Mm-hmm. Did they turn out to be a resource for you?
The book that you all did, that was very helpful. The oral histories in that book. I had been a part of the Hanover Black Heritage Society, but when I started grad school, I gave up everything because I was commuting 2 hours a day, and I had always wanted to study history, but I never had studied history. I have an undergrad in political science and criminal justice. I have a master's in criminal justice. But at some point, I just thought, my high school guidance counselor talked me out of being a history major because I had no desire to be a teacher. And she said that was the only job I could get with a degree in history, and I didn't want to waste my parents' money. And so I was struggling to stay, I was learning. I would sit in class and people would say these words like historiography and hegemony and teleology. I was a student affairs administrator. We didn't do all of that, and so I was so busy trying to just keep up that I canceled memberships and everything, canceled lunch with friends. I was just in a zone. And so, but certainly that book that Don and some of my other good friends were involved in was very helpful.
Well, I have to say we're glad you were in that zone because of what you have delivered to us and what you have unveiled about Black life in Hanover County. So time well spent. Okay. Thank you all for. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I just want to very quickly say thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for that correction at the beginning of the discussion. And please accept my sincere apology, Jody.
It's just a month old.
Well, congratulations. So,
I got tenure on February 7th, so.
Dr. Allen and Dr. Martin will be available for a short while in Commonwealth Hall immediately after the lecture. And of course, you can pick up copies of Dr. Allen's new book in our gift shop upstairs. So thank you again for your support. Thank you again to our speakers. It's been a really
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.